Hello and welcome to technically lesson 4, but the third time we've looked at procedures and functions. This is software design and development for higher computing science. So this is going to be the last time we look at subprograms and routines on its own, functions and procedures. Next time we're going to look at records and arrays of records, but every program that we create from now on will make use of subprograms, so you're going to still get to practice, you're going to still experience how they work, so don't worry about that. Right, the last program we made, it had two functions. We had the calc average and the get numbers functions. And it used those functions to get a bunch of numbers and then calculate the average. And it displayed the answer to the user. Let's create a new program. Functions and procedures 3. Last time we made a program, I told you that it's best practice to create your functions and procedures at the top and then have the main program at the bottom that makes use of the functions and procedures. And that is true. But something that the SQA really likes is when you separate your functions and procedures into inputs, processes, and outputs. If we go back to the course specification, you can see that part of the analysis is to identify the inputs, processes, and outputs of the program. So it's always a good idea to create functions and procedures that are used for inputs, processes, and outputs. So let's do that today. Now let's just write some comments in our main program that's going to kind of tell us what our program's going to do. So first of all, we're going to get names and ages of people in the room. That's going to be our input. Then we're going to calculate the average age of everyone. Then we're going to display the average to the user. So these are the main steps of our program. So what we need are functions that are going to allow us to do this. Now we could start with the main program and then work our way backwards and then create the functions, but I like to create the functions first. So let's create one. Define a new function called getData. Now this isn't a very good name. Normally you would want your variable names and function names to be meaningful. This one is not that meaningful because we don't know what type of data we're getting from it. But for now, this will do. Now we're going to use two arrays, one for names and one for ages. Then what we'll do is get the number of people from the user, enter the number of people in the room. And then for that number of people, we will get their names and ages. So names.append the input, enter the name of person. First time it'll be of person 1 and so on. And then what we can do, now here's a really cool thing you can do. In the ages array, I can use the name that I just entered in my message asking for the age. So it's an integer from the keyboard, input, and I'll say enter the age of, and then I can add the name of the person at location X. So if this is the first time round, X will be 0, and once I've added a name at location 0 will be the name that I just added. And it doesn't matter how many names you've added, X will always contain the last one that was entered in this loop. Now by the time we get to this line, we've entered all the names, we've entered all the ages, so we have two arrays with all the names and ages. Now one good thing about Python is that you can return multiple things. We can return the names and the ages in one line and just separating it by a comma, similarly to how you would pass in variables through the brackets. Now the only thing to be aware of is that the order of these variable names is important. It's important to note that names is first, then it's ages. Right, so let's go to our main program. Now how do we activate this and get the names and ages out of this? Well, we do the same thing as before, but we're using two variables to contain this. We've got the names and the ages, and they will contain what comes out of getData. Now you'll notice that I've used the same variable names in the function as the main program. Now that doesn't matter, but they are technically different variables, different arrays. They just happen to have the same name. Next up, calculate the average of everyone. Well, we did a calc average function in our previous program. Now I'm going to pass in all the ages, but it doesn't matter what I pass in. I'm still going to do it in the same way. We've got the total that starts at 0, and then for every age in the ages array, I'm going to add that age to the total. And then at the end, I'm going to say the average equals the total divided by the length of ages. And then return the average. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to slightly improve the efficiency of this subprogram, this function here. Now if we look at the average variable, it only exists purely to temporarily store the result of this calculation and then immediately return the result of that calculation. So what we can do instead of storing the result and then returning it, just return the result immediately like that. No need for the average variable at all. So we've saved a little bit of processing time and a little bit of storage in the computer's RAM. Not a huge amount, but it's a tiny saving in time and space. And if you do this a lot, every time you write a program, you're going to have small increments in efficiency, and it's going to add up over time. So we've got our inputs from the user. We've got our process, which is calculating the average. Let's add the process to the main program. So we're going to get the average age, and it's going to be taken from the calc average function, which takes in all the ages. There we are. Next thing we need to do is display the average to the user. Now, obviously, we only have one variable that we need to display, so we could easily just print something like the average age is, and then add that to the message. And this will work. It'll be perfectly fine. But the SQA do like functions and procedures for all inputs, processes, and outputs. Now, it's not necessary. You probably wouldn't be marked down for this. But if you're displaying multiple things, it's probably better to bundle all your outputs in one procedure and then activate that procedure rather than to add a bunch of outputs to your main program. So let's just add a final procedure called display answer, something like that. And it's going to take the average, and we'll just print the message that we had before. Print that message. There we are. The average age is, and then average age. Notice I've got a different variable name here. In the definition, I've called it average, but in the body of this function, it's actually a procedure, I've called it average age. Is that important? Yes, it is. Inside functions and procedures, the variables inside them must be consistent. So average and average within this function, or procedure in this case. In the main program, it's important that you've got consistent variable names as well. Here I've called it average age. It's called average age still in the main program here. It's ages, and names apparently is never used. Terrible program. So it's important to think of these as their own self-contained little blocks of code that, even though it relates to further down in the main program, it's not technically related. Like, it's not strongly connected. It's just that you're using the main program to get this data. So it's its own little block of code. That's one way to think of it. And likewise, each of these little blocks of code, from the definition to the return, or if there is no return, just to the end of the function or procedure, it's its own little block of code that the rest of the program is not involved with, other than asking the function to do its work. So the last thing here, instead of printing this message, I'm going to ask this function, this procedure rather, to do its thing. Now you might notice I'm mixing up the word function and procedure, and you might be thinking, what is the difference? Well, I did mention previously, but I didn't harp on about it, but a function returns values. A procedure does not return values. You might be thinking to yourself, why does it matter? Well, in Python, it doesn't matter. It makes no difference whether it's a function or a procedure, but there are programming languages that care. Some programming languages don't have a single keyword, like def, to create a function or a procedure. They will actually have the word function or the word procedure if it is a procedure. And the difference, as I said, is that a function returns values, like this one returns the result of a calculation. This one returns 2 arrays full of data. A procedure returns nothing. This doesn't return anything. So that's the difference. Now, when activating a procedure, because it doesn't return anything, you don't need a variable to contain the result of that function or procedure. Obviously, a function returns a value, so you do need a variable to store it. But this is a procedure, no variable required. Right, let's run it to see that it works. So let's say we've got 3 people. We've got Biff, and Biff is 23. We've got Jeff, who's 93, he's an old guy. And we've got Sally, who is 33. Now what is the problem? The name average is not defined. What you tack in boot? On line 32, away down here. Now look at this, exactly what I was saying before. The main program has to have consistent variable names. What did I call the average age in the main program? It's called average age. I then tried to pass in a variable called average. In my main program, there is no variable called average. See, I just fell for my own trick that I was telling you to be aware of. My goodness, what a doofus. Let's try it again. 3 people. Biff. He's suddenly a different age. We've got Jeff. And we've got Sally. There we go, it's working now. 46.0. Beautiful! Right, that was the 3rd lesson on functions and procedures, your 4th lesson on software design and development for higher level. It's the last time we're going to specifically look at functions and procedures. Next time we're going to look at records and arrays of records. Hope you've enjoyed this one. Give it a practice. Have fun. I'll see you in the next one.